Hello everyone, welcome to this session on monetary policy strategies. So in our earlier discussions, we examined how central banks influence the economy through their monetary policy tools. And today we shift our focus to the strategic choices that guide how monetary policy is implemented in practice. At the heart of this discussion lies a critical question. Should a central bank focus on controlling the money supply, or should it focus on stabilizing interest rates? So different strategies have emerged over time, and each with its own rationale and trade-offs. One is monetary targeting, that the money supply targeting, monetary aggregate targeting, that is one. So this approach emphasizing controlling the growth of money supply to influence inflation and economic activity. And it was more prominent in the 1970s and 1980s, especially when central banks sought to restrain high inflation. Then the second approach is interest rate targeting. Instead of focusing on money supply, central banks may target short-term interest rates directly. So this strategy provides more predictable conditions for financial markets and the broader economy, but relies heavily on a stable money demand. Then it also has an approach called implicit anchoring and inflation targeting. So here, especially in recent decades, many central banks have moved towards strategies that anchor expectations, often through an explicit or implicit inflation target. So this reflects a growing understanding that shaping public expectation is as important as the immediate policy instrument. So in this session, we will explore the pros and cons of these competing strategies and their historical relevance, and how central banks decide which approach best suits their economic context. So here we'll also touch upon on the growing adoption of inflation targeting as a framework that balances credibility with flexibility. So in short, by the end of this session, I hope that you will have a clearer understanding of how central banks design their strategies and why they sometimes shift from one approach to another, and how these choices influence financial markets and the real economy. So shortly summarizing the strategies, there are competing strategies are there. One is mainly between monetary aggregate, whether to target the money supply, M3 money, or target directly on the interest rate. So the first one is called monetary targeting, that is targeting on the money supply, for example the monetary aggregates like M3. Second one is interest rate targeting, directly target the interest rate, especially the short-term interest rate, for example Fed fund rate in the US and repo rate in India. Then implicit anchoring, instead of focusing on monetary targeting and interest rate targeting, may target something based on the existing situation at the current situation. Either there may be an implicit anchoring, maybe using inflation targeting or any other relevant monetary variable at that time. So coming to the first one is the monetary aggregates targeting. So you recall the ultimate target, because though we are using the targets like monetary aggregate targeting and interest rate targeting, but the ultimate target in any economy are, one is unemployment rate, inflation rate, and economic growth, that is growth in real GDP. So the ultimate targets that the monetary authority would like to control are macroeconomic goal variables, so which I already listed out here. But in order to attain this ultimate target, monetary authority use intermediate targets. That is, one of them is monetary aggregate, for example M3 money supply. So simply an intermediate target is a variable that central bank controls, not because the variable is important in its own right, but because by controlling it, the policymakers believe they are influencing the ultimate policy targets in a predictable way. For instance, inflation rate, economic growth, unemployment rate, etc. So the success depends on the exact relationship between money supply and the goal variable, the intermediate target and the ultimate targets. So here we can, the mechanism, how does it work? Here we can recall some of our discussion from the financial market discussion, the bond market, where suppose we have seen there that if there is an increase in money supply, the central bank injects more money in the economy, then the expected transmission mechanism is in a way that it will create portfolio disequilibrium. You know that there is then when there is more money with the general public, then there will be a portfolio disequilibrium. That means they will be investing, because when they have more money, then the demand for bond price increases. When the bond price increases, then you know that the rate of interest will be declining. Right. So that means changes in money supply is going to create a portfolio disequilibrium, and subsequently is going to affect the interest rate through the bond market. So in the second stage, when the rate of interest changes, for instance, there is a decline in the rate of interest. When there is a decline in the rate of interest, what you can see that the cost of borrowing for the firms declines. Not only that, there will be more money with the general public, because the general public, they will make more demand for durable items. For example, vehicles and other durable items, there will be increased demand. So this all make the economic conditions more optimistic, and because the cost of borrowing is low for the firms and there is more liquidity with the general public, their demand will increase. Then as a result, there will be an increase in investment by firms. Investment by firms means they will be buying, expanding their production facilities. They will be buying more machines and tools. That means they are making more demand for capital goods. Then you know that more investment, when the production capacity has been increased, when they expand their firms or expand their operation, then that is going to be increase the GDP. That is the del Y, that is the GDP increases. So GDP increases means the employment also increases, and the income of general public, income of factors of production also increases. That means economic growth takes place. This is one target. Second one is interest rate targeting. So interest rate targeting is the current strategy of the Federal Reserve and of the central banks of the other major industrialized economies. So the Fed fund rate is the interest rate target. You know that in the last session we discussed that. The FFR determination in the US is as part of the interest rate targeting. And in India, you know that the repo rate, this is also a part of interest rate targeting. So using monetary policy tools, that is the open market operation, discount window and recurve reserve ratio, they influence the interest rate in the country. And once these interest rates are determined, then using the theorem that the term structure and risk structure of interest rate, you can see that this interest rate will be related to other interest rate. Theoretically, there will be a relationship. So important thing is that keeping the Fed fund rate at the target level might require large open market purchases or sales, and therefore large change in the money supply. A focus on the interest rate is in fact an alternative to targeting a monetary aggregate. Fed cannot in general do both. So you cannot target monetary aggregate and interest rate simultaneously. So you can either on money, that monetary aggregate, that is money supply, or interest rate. And second point is short-term interest rates can be observed contemporaneously and be closely controlled. The open market does just looks at the computer screen and sees the current Fed fund rate. So therefore, FFR is a short-term operating target, but the money supply is only observed with a lag of a week or two, and then only with error. So if the money supply is a target, some other variable that is more frequently observable, such as the level of bank rate, must serve as an operating target. And interest rate targeting focuses on short-term interest rates such as Fed fund rate and the repo rate. Fed fund rate in the US and repo rate in India. So long-term interest rates can also be observed contemporaneously but cannot be closely controlled by central banks. In addition to monetary aggregate targeting and interest rate targeting, there is implicit anchoring is there. That means Feds just do it, monetary policy strategy. That means from 1980s up until the time Ben Bernanke became the chair of the Fed Reserve in 2006, the Fed Reserve was able to achieve excellent macroeconomic performance, including low and stable inflation, and it did so without using an explicit nominal anchor such as inflation target. So here, although the Federal Reserve didn't articulate an explicit strategy that the inflation, this much is the inflation is our target, instead of that, a coherent strategy for the conduct of monetary policy existed nonetheless. This strategy involved an implicit but not an explicit nominal anchor in the form of an overriding concern on the part of the Federal Reserve to control inflation in the long run. So, in addition, it involved forward-looking behavior that included careful monitoring for signs of future inflation using a wide range of information coupled with periodic preemptive strikes by monetary policy against the threat of inflation. So, in India, initially we are now focusing more towards inflation targeting. Since 2016, inflation targeting by adjusting on interest rate targeting we have been following. So that means by using the target, that the interest rate target, you focusing on interest target instead of money supply target, monetary aggregate target, we focus mainly on the final goal, because the intermediate goal now is interest rate targeting, then our final goal is inflation targeting, but at the same time other ultimate goal, for example GDP, employment rate, and also the foreign exchange rate, all these come there, but in order to attain everything, finally the main focus will be on inflation. So the report of the Committee on Financial Sector Reforms in 2009 highlighted the importance of focusing on inflation. And since the expert committee set up in 2030 to review the objectives and conduct of monetary policy in a globalized and highly interconnected environment. And this committee reviewed the organizational structure, operating framework and instruments, monetary policy, liquidity management framework to ensure compatibility with macroeconomic and financial stability as well as market development. So finally, the committee recommended a target level of inflation at 4% with a band of plus or minus 2% around it. So in that way, you can see that the lowest target level is 2% and the upper limit is 6%. So the tolerance band was formulated in the light of the vulnerability of the Indian economy to supply and external shocks and relatively large weight on food in the CPI basket. So the expert committee recommended inflation to be the nominal anchor. This is the key point here. Another key point is that inflation to be the nominal anchor of the monetary policy framework in India, as flexible inflation targeting recognizes existence of growth inflation trade-off in the short run, and stabilizing and anchoring inflation expectation is critical for ensuring price stability on an enduring basis. So I'm just showing you the monetary policy linkages, the monetary targeting in India, the operational framework from 1985 to 1998. After that, I will show you the recent framework, the framework that we have been adopting. So you can just see here that on the left hand side, these are the instruments. So this instrument now you are more familiar. CRR, that is the required reserve ratio, and open market operation and lending to banks, and foreign exchange operations, net forex purchase by RBI. And then the operating target was reserve aggregates, target on So mainly the monetary base M0, and the intermediate target was monetary aggregates. Monetary aggregate is the M3 money supply. So from 1985 to 1998, our focus intermediate target was money supply or monetary aggregates, in short M3. And the goals that now you are familiar: price stability, economic growth, financial stability, foreign exchange market stability. So economic growth also means here the employment. When economic growth is there, is also understood that there will be simultaneous employment growth as well. So I have taken this from this author. You can get the full text of this one doing a search of this author. From 2016 onwards, there is a structural change in our monetary policy framework. The linkages here you can see now the instruments, it became the policy rate. Repo rate is the main instrument that is called policy rates. Often instead of directly referring repo rate, sometimes people use it policy rate. Then the liquidity facilities that came into existence, the one we covered in the previous slides. Reserve requirements, now you are familiar: open market operation, lending to bank rate, and foreign exchange operations. So these are the instruments, and the short term interest rate, that is the operating targets, and short term, this is the repo rate here with the short term interest rate. This interest rate, this is the intermediate target. So you can see in the previous diagram, we have seen monetary aggregate is the intermediate target, but since 2016 onwards, interest rate is the intermediate target. Then the ultimate targets that remain same: price stability, economic growth, financial stability, foreign exchange market stability. So you can see how evolving the monetary policies have been evolving over time. Even about the instrument there is change, and even about the intermediate targets there was change. So let's now move to make a review of some recent developments. Recently, inflation targeting became one of the main strategy of monetary policy strategy. So about the ultimate target, you can see that these are the ultimate target. Now countries across the globe began to focus mainly on price stability. And you always see that there is a trade-off between price inflation and economic growth. Suppose if the central bank expand money supply, there will be declining rate of interest that will promote economic growth, but at the same time there will be increase in money supply will lead to inflation. So one is inflation targeting, that growing interest recently. The thing is that would reduce, theoretical expectation is that it would reduce effect of political pressures on central banks, because say the central banks are given mandate, because for in India you know that 4% plus or minus, that is the inflation target. So the central government theoretically shouldn't intervene here as long as the central bank is fulfilling the inflation target, that is 4% plus or minus 2. So in general, the move to inflation targeting coincides with a grant of greater independence of two central banks. So central bank independent control of its policy instruments and a clear mandate to target inflation greatly limits government's ability to manipulate monetary policy for political purposes. So another pragmatic motivation for the move to inflation targeting in several countries was that they experienced problems similar to those the United States experienced with the monetary aggregates as the intermediate targets. So it involves, the inflation targeting involves several elements. One is public announcement of medium-term numerical objectives, that is target for inflation. For example, in India, currently it is 4% plus or minus 2, right? That is the public announcement of the medium-term target. An institutional commitment to price stability as the primary and long-run goal of monetary policy, and a commitment to achieve the inflation goal. As long as by using this inflation targeting, always the central bank's main focus is on that there shouldn't be any instability in inflation. Always this within the limit, right? So that's an institutional commitment to price stability. An information inclusive approach in which many variables, not just monetary aggregates, are used in making decisions about monetary policy. And increased inflation targeting, transparency of the monetary policy strategy through communication with the public and markets about the plans and objectives of the policy makers, and this will help the businesses and firms to make a better plan their financial portfolio and also make their investment decisions. And furthermore, important thing is that it enhances the increased accountability of the central bank for attaining its inflation objectives. So I am listing out key advantages of inflation targeting. One is there will be time inconsistency problem. So time inconsistency problem arises when a future policy plan is no longer optimal at a later date, even when new information has arrived in the meantime. So here, when the policymakers or the central bank clearly define this is the inflation targeting, this is the inflation that they want to achieve, so it reduces the time inconsistency. And second one is I've already mentioned, increase transparency. Inflation targeting has the advantage that is readily understood by the public and is thus highly transparent. And then increase accountability of the central bank. So that means the tendency toward increase accountability of the central bank, it enhances. So indeed, transparency and communication go hand in hand with increased accountability. And it is consistent with democratic principles, because not only is accountability valuable in its own right, but it also makes the institutional framework for the conduct of monetary policy more consistent with democratic principle. Because you know that the central bankers, they are not the elected members from the general public, they are elite group. So inflation targeting framework promotes the accountability of the central bank to elected officials, that is to the government and people representative, who are given some responsibility for setting the goals of monetary policy and then monitoring the economic outcomes. And overall, there will be improved performance, that the inflation targeting countries seem to have significantly reduced both the rate of inflation and inflation expectation, and it has implication in the efficient working of the macroeconomy, including so many markets, that the labor market and the product market. However, there are some disadvantages there. One is delayed signaling. That means inflation is not easily controlled by monetary authorities alone. You can see that, for example, if there is increase in production, if the production of goods and services increase, then if there are more goods and services coming into the market, then you can see that the supply increases, then price decline. The demand and supply framework that you're using, that you are familiar with that. Similarly, if there is some supply shock, then that will lead to inflation. So simply, the main point here is that inflation is not only easily controlled by monetary authorities alone, it also determined by other economic aspects. Then in addition, there is a delayed signaling as well. There will, because of the long lags in the effects of monetary policy, inflation outcomes are revealed only after a substantial lag. Then too much rigidity, because some economists criticize inflation targeting because they believe it imposes a rigid rule on monetary policy makers and limits their ability to respond to unforeseen circumstances. For example, in India, if 4% plus or minus, so always the attention for the mandate for the central bank is to maintain this. So if they have to respond to some unforeseen circumstances and to do some firefighting, sometimes this framework sometimes constrain them in doing so. And there can be potential for increased output fluctuations, and this is another criticism. And it also can affect economic growth, because if every time the focus is mainly on inflation targeting, sometimes if the economy is in crisis, at that time the rate of interest has to be reduced to the bottom level, and at that it needs to allow the inflation to jump maybe more than 6%. Sometimes if they increase money supply like anything, then the rate of interest will go at the bottom, and that will revive the economy. Because cost of borrowing will decline for the producers, firms, and consumers will get cheap credit, cheap money, and on that way it will revive the economy. But the cost will be that there will be inflation. But if there is an inflation targeting framework, limit is there, then central banks cannot increase money supply to reduce the rate of interest. Then it will hamper the economic growth. So let me also give you some insights on recent international experience. New Zealand is the champion of this inflation targeting. They initiated in 1989. So to maintain stability in the general level of prices. So they mandates that Minister of Finance and the Governor of the Reserve Bank of New Zealand agree on monetary policy targets to achieve price stability. For much of the 1990s, price stability was defined as an inflation rate within a range of 0 to 2%. In 1997, this definition was loosened to a bit to a range of 0 to 3%. As I already said that New Zealand was the champion, inflation was brought down and remained within the target most of the time. Economic growth has been generally been high and unemployment rate has come down significantly. And Canada started this policy in 1991, then United Kingdom in 1992, India, you know that in 2016 we have started inflation targeting. And I'll show you how the inflation moves before and after inflation targeting. So you can see, for example, New Zealand. This is the inflation targeting year this year, and before and after you look here, this area you can see that there is huge fluctuation, vast fluctuation in inflation, but afterwards this period you can see that fluctuation is very less. Similarly here as well, here also there is fluctuation is very high, but after once they adopted the inflation targeting, you can see from this figure that there is stability in inflation. In this session, we have discussed the monetary policy strategies. Mainly, we discussed monetary aggregate targeting, interest rate targeting, and nominal anchor as the intermediate target. Then we talked about inflation targeting as the ultimate target. Then we also see that we also discussed some of the pros and cons of it. Thank you for watching this session, and see you in the next session. Thank you.